Sergeant Marcus Thompson stood at the edge of Buckingham Palace's ceremonial grounds, his dress blue uniform perfectly pressed despite the long transatlantic flight. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard where tourists gathered behind velvet ropes, cameras clicking as they captured the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Marcus had seen many military traditions during his 8 years in the Marines, but nothing quite like this. He wasn't supposed to be here. His leave papers said he should be visiting his cousin in Manchester, taking a well-deserved break after his 3rd deployment to Afghanistan. But something had drawn him to London, to this place where military precision met royal pageantry. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that had followed him home from the desert. The sense that ceremonies like this felt hollow when you'd seen real sacrifice. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony began. Marcus watched the royal guards march in perfect formation, their red uniforms blazing against the gray stone palace. Their bearskin hats stood 18 inches tall, making each guard appear larger than life. Every movement was calculated, every step measured. The tourists oohed and awed at the spectacle, phones recording every moment. Marcus found himself studying their faces, or what little he could see beneath the ceremonial headgear. These weren't just parade soldiers. He could tell by the way they carried themselves. Real military bearing came from experience, not just training. Still, something about the whole display bothered him. All this pomp and circumstance while real soldiers were dying in foreign lands. Fighting wars most people preferred to forget. A family from Texas struck up a conversation with him, recognizing his American military bearing even in civilian clothes. The father, a veteran himself, pointed out the guards' weapons. "Those rifles aren't just for show," he explained to his teenage son. "These guys are real soldiers. Some of them have probably seen combat." Marcus nodded politely but said nothing. He knew about combat. He knew about the weight of a rifle in your hands when lives depended on your training. He knew about standing watch while your brothers slept, knowing that your alertness was all that stood between them and death. This ceremony, beautiful as it was, felt like playing dress-up compared to the raw reality he'd left behind. The ceremony proceeded with clockwork precision. Guards marched, turned, and saluted in movements that had been perfected over centuries. The crowd watched in respectful silence, broken only by the occasional whispered explanation or the soft click of camera shutters. Marcus found himself drawn into the rhythm despite his reservations. There was something hypnotic about such perfect coordination, but then something unexpected happened. One of the guards, younger than the others, stumbled slightly during a complex maneuver. It was barely noticeable, a half step out of sync, a momentary break in the perfect formation. The crowd didn't notice, but Marcus did. More importantly, he saw how the other guards seamlessly adjusted to cover for their colleague, maintaining the illusion of perfection. That small moment of humanity in the midst of ceremony struck something deep in Marcus. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers playing roles. They were real people, real military personnel doing their duty. The stumble reminded him of his own early days in the Corps, when the pressure to perform perfectly felt overwhelming. He remembered his drill instructor's words. "Perfection isn't about never falling down. It's about how quickly you get back up." After the ceremony ended and the crowds began to disperse, Marcus lingered. He wasn't sure why, but something kept him rooted to the spot. The guards had returned to their posts, standing motionless as tourists posed for pictures nearby. Their stillness was remarkable, like statues brought to life then frozen again. An elderly British woman noticed Marcus watching. "First time seeing the ceremony?" she asked with a kind smile. "I've lived in London all my life, and it never gets old. My grandfather was a guardsman during the war. He used to say that standing guard wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing everything while pretending to see nothing." Her words resonated with Marcus. He thought about his own grandfather, a World War II veteran who had rarely spoken about his service. The old man had carried himself with quiet dignity, never seeking attention for his sacrifices. Maybe that's what bothered Marcus about ceremonies like this. Not the guards themselves, but the way people treated military service like entertainment. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus continued to observe. He watched tourists try to make the guards react, children waving at them, adults posing for selfies. The guards remained perfectly still, professional in the face of constant attention. It reminded him of his own training, the discipline required to maintain focus regardless of distractions. But he also saw something else. In the eyes of the guard closest to him, Marcus recognized a familiar look. It was the same expression he'd seen in mirrors during his own deployments. The weight of responsibility, the constant alertness, the readiness to act if needed. This wasn't just ceremonial duty. These guards were genuinely protecting one of the most important buildings in Britain. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd been judging these soldiers based on appearances, dismissing their service because it looked different from his own. But duty was duty, whether it was standing watch in Afghanistan or protecting a palace in London. The uniform might be different, the setting more formal, but the commitment was the same. As the day shifted toward evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He approached the barrier separating tourists from the guards, his military bearing evident in every step. Several people noticed him moving with purpose, and conversations began to quiet. Something was about to happen, though no one could guess what. The guard he approached was young, maybe early 20s, with the kind of intense focus that came from serious training. Marcus stopped just short of the barrier and did something that caught everyone off guard. He came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute, not the casual gesture civilians sometimes offered, but the crisp, precise salute of one professional soldier acknowledging another. The tourist area fell completely silent. Phones stopped clicking. Conversations ceased. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something significant, though few understood exactly what. The American Marine stood at perfect attention, holding his salute, waiting for a response from the British guardsman who wasn't supposed to move, wasn't supposed to break character, wasn't supposed to acknowledge anything happening around him. Time seemed suspended as two warriors from different nations faced each other across a barrier of protocol and tradition. The Marine challenged the Royal Guard. Part 2. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus held his salute steady, his arm locked in position as if carved from stone. Around him, the tourist crowd had grown larger as word spread through whispered conversations and pointed fingers. Someone was challenging a royal guard, and everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Private James Wellington had been standing guard for 2 hours when the American appeared. At first, he'd seemed like any other tourist, observing, taking pictures, moving through the crowd. But James had noticed something different about this one. The way he carried himself, the way he studied the ceremony with knowing eyes rather than simple curiosity. This man understood military bearing in a way most civilians didn't. Now that same man stood at attention, rendering a salute that James recognized as perfect in every detail. The positioning, the timing, the unwavering steadiness, this was no amateur gesture. This was one soldier acknowledging another, and it put James in an impossible position. Protocol demanded he remain motionless, ignore all distractions, maintain his post regardless of what happened around him. But military tradition, the deeper code that connected warriors across nations and conflicts, demanded he acknowledge a brother's respect. Marcus could see the conflict playing out in the guard's eyes. The young soldier's face remained impassive, but his eyes showed the internal struggle. Marcus had been in similar situations during his own service, moments when duty and honor seemed to pull in different directions. He understood the weight of expectation pressing down on the guardsman. The crowd sensed the tension. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view. Teenagers stopped texting long enough to watch real drama unfold. An elderly veteran in the crowd recognized what was happening and quietly removed his cap, standing straighter despite his age. Others followed suit without fully understanding why. Marcus thought about his fallen brothers as he held his salute. Rodriguez, who died protecting a village in Afghanistan. Chen, killed by an IED during their second deployment. Williams, who'd made it home only to lose his battle with invisible wounds. They deserved recognition, but they would never receive the formal ceremonies and public acknowledgement these guards received daily. This salute was for them too, for all the warriors who served without fanfare. The minutes ticked by. Security personnel had noticed the unusual situation developing and were quietly moving into position. Not aggressively. They recognized this wasn't a threat, but professionally, ready to intervene if necessary. A palace official spoke quietly into his radio, describing the scene to supervisors who would decide how to handle this unprecedented situation. James felt sweat beginning to form under his bearskin cap despite the cool London air. His training screamed at him to ignore the salute, to maintain his post, to follow protocol. But deeper training, the kind that connected all soldiers regardless of flag or uniform, urged him to respond. This American had offered respect, and honor demanded acknowledgement. In the crowd, people began to understand they were witnessing something significant. A middle-aged woman who'd been complaining about tourist crowds just minutes before now watched in respectful silence. A group of college students put away their phones, sensing that some moments weren't meant to be captured but simply experienced. Marcus's shoulder began to burn from holding the salute, but he didn't waver. He'd held harder positions for longer periods in far worse conditions. This was nothing compared to standing watch in the Afghan heat or maintaining position during contact with enemy forces. But this was different too. This was personal. This was one warrior's attempt to bridge the gap between ceremony and service, between tradition and truth. The palace official finished his radio conversation and approached Marcus with careful steps. He was an older man, probably career military himself based on his bearing. His job was to maintain order and protocol, but his experience told him this situation required delicate handling. The American wasn't creating a disturbance in any traditional sense. He was simply standing at attention and saluting. But the effect on the crowd, and potentially on the guard, could be significant, sir, the official said quietly, positioning himself where he could speak to Marcus without blocking the view of the guard. I understand your gesture, but I'm afraid this isn't appropriate. The guards are on duty and cannot respond to individual acknowledgments. Marcus didn't move, didn't even look at the official. His eyes remained fixed on the young guardsman's face. I know my military courtesy, sir, he replied without breaking his position. I'm offering respect to a fellow soldier. I'll hold this position until it's properly acknowledged or until I'm physically removed. The official's eyebrows rose slightly. He recognized determination when he saw it, and this American wasn't going to be easily dissuaded. More concerning was the crowd's reaction. What had started as casual tourist observation was becoming something more focused, more intense. People were choosing sides without fully understanding the conflict, but sensing its importance. James could hear the quiet conversation happening near the barrier. Though he couldn't make out specific words, he knew officials were probably trying to resolve the situation, but he also knew they were caught in the same bind he was. Protocol versus respect, regulation versus recognition. The military was built on following orders, but it was also built on honor between warriors. A tour group from Germany had stopped to watch, their guide explaining in whispered tones what little he understood about the situation. A family from Australia found themselves pushed to the front of the growing crowd, their planned quick photo opportunity turning into something they would remember forever. An elderly British veteran began explaining to his grandson about military traditions and the respect soldiers showed each other across national boundaries. Marcus's mind drifted to his first deployment, when his unit had worked alongside British forces in Helmand Province. He remembered sharing rations with a British sergeant who'd shown him pictures of his children back home in Manchester. They'd talked about their different training, their different traditions, but they'd understood each other perfectly when it came to the weight of wearing the uniform and the responsibility of protecting others. That sergeant had worn the same regimental insignia, James now displayed on his collar. Different men, different wars perhaps, but the same commitment to duty. Marcus wondered if James had deployed, if he'd seen combat, if he carried the same memories that Marcus fought to process. The young guard's eyes suggested he understood more than ceremonial duty. The palace official tried a different approach. Sergeant Thompson, he said, somehow having learned Marcus's name and rank. Your service is appreciated, but you're putting this guardsman in an impossible position. He cannot respond without breaking protocol that's been maintained for centuries. Then maybe it's time to examine that protocol, Marcus replied, his voice carrying clearly in the unnaturally quiet courtyard. Warriors have always acknowledged each other. That's older than any ceremony. The crowd stirred at his words. Several people nodded unconsciously, though they might not have been able to explain why. Something about the American statement felt fundamentally true, even to those who had never served in any military capacity. 20 minutes had passed since Marcus first raised his salute, and the situation had evolved beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a simple gesture of respect had become a test of wills, a clash between rigid protocol and military brotherhood. The crowd had grown to over 100 people, all drawn by word of mouth and the magnetic pull of human drama unfolding in real time. James felt the weight of every eye upon him. His training screamed at him to remain motionless, to ignore everything except his duty to guard his post. But Marcus's unwavering salute had awakened something deeper, a connection to the fundamental purpose behind all the ceremony and tradition. The American wasn't mocking the guards or trying to embarrass anyone. He was offering the highest form of military respect, and it felt wrong to ignore it. Behind the palace walls, senior officers were having heated discussions about how to handle the unprecedented situation. Colonel Patricia Ashworth, the day's commanding officer, watched through surveillance cameras as the standoff continued. She'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan herself and understood exactly what the American Marine was doing. She also understood why her guardsman was struggling with the situation. "Sir," she said to her superior over the phone, "this isn't a security threat or a publicity stunt. This is one soldier paying respects to another. The American has been standing at perfect attention for over 20 minutes. That's not the behavior of someone trying to cause trouble." The response from London District Headquarters was predictable. Maintain protocol, end the situation quietly, don't create an incident. But Colonel Ashworth could see the faces in the crowd through the cameras. This had moved beyond a simple disruption. People were emotionally invested in the outcome now. Marcus's legs had begun to feel the strain of holding position, but he'd endured far worse. During his second deployment, he'd maintained watch for 6 hours straight during a particularly dangerous patrol. This was nothing compared to that except for the emotional weight. Each minute that passed felt like a small victory for military tradition over bureaucratic inflexibility. A BBC news crew had arrived, alerted by a tourist social media post that had already been shared thousands of times. The reporter, Sarah Chen, was a veteran journalist who'd covered military stories throughout her career. She recognized the significance of what was happening and began conducting quiet interviews with crowd members. "It's about respect," said Margaret Williams, the elderly woman who'd spoken to Marcus earlier. "My grandfather would have understood. Soldiers recognize soldiers regardless of what flag they serve under." A young father holding his 5-year-old daughter explained to the reporter, "I'm not military, but I can see this means something important. The American man is being very respectful. He's not causing trouble or being loud. He's just honoring the guard, I think." The 5-year-old Emma had been watching with wide eyes since the beginning. She tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Daddy, why won't the soldier with the big hat say hello back? The man in blue is being nice." Her innocent question cut through the complexity of protocol and regulation to the heart of basic human courtesy. Several people in the crowd smiled despite the tension, and a few others began to murmur agreement with the child's simple observation. James heard the little girl's comment and felt his resolve wavering. She was right in the uncomplicated way children often were. Marcus was being nice, was showing respect, and basic courtesy demanded acknowledgement. But his oath, his duty, his entire military identity was built on following orders and maintaining discipline. The palace official had been joined by 2 others, including a woman in civilian clothes who Marcus recognized as likely being senior brass, despite her casual appearance. Military officers developed a certain bearing that civilian clothes couldn't disguise. They were discussing the situation in low voices, occasionally glancing at him and then at the guard. Marcus caught fragments of their conversation. Unprecedented situation. Media attention. Need to end this quietly. But he also heard something else that gave him hope. Clearly military. Showing proper respect, not actually violating anything. A group of American tourists had recognized Marcus as one of their own and were quietly showing their support. An older man approached the barrier near Marcus and came to attention himself, though his civilian posture wasn't as precise. He was followed by 2 younger men who Marcus suspected were also veterans based on their bearing. "Semper Fi, Marine," one of them said quietly. "You're doing the right thing." The show of support seemed to energize the crowd. More people straightened their postures, and the general mood shifted from curiosity to solidarity. What had started as entertainment was becoming a statement about respect and military tradition. James could feel the emotional temperature of the crowd changing. These weren't just tourists watching a spectacle anymore. They were people invested in seeing honor properly acknowledged. The pressure to respond was becoming overwhelming, but the pressure to maintain protocol was equally strong. Colonel Ashworth made a decision that would later be debated in military circles for years. She left her office and walked to the courtyard, her presence immediately noted by the other officials. She was a tall woman with graying hair and the kind of authoritative bearing that commanded attention without effort. "What's the situation?" she asked the palace official, though she clearly understood exactly what was happening. "American Marine, ma'am. Been saluting for about 30 minutes now. Won't move until Private Wellington acknowledges him. We've tried to convince him to stand down, but he's quite determined." Colonel Ashworth studied Marcus for a long moment, taking in his perfect military bearing, his unwavering discipline, his obvious respect for proper protocol, even while challenging it. She then looked at Private Wellington, seeing the internal conflict written in his eyes despite his motionless exterior. "Has he violated any actual regulations?" she asked. "Well, no, ma'am. He's not actually doing anything wrong. He's just saluting. And is Private Wellington in any danger? Is this disrupting security?" "No, ma'am. If anything, the American's military bearing is quite impressive. The crowd is behaving respectfully." Colonel Ashworth nodded slowly. She'd spent her career balancing duty with humanity, protocol with common sense. This situation was testing all of those skills at once. The BBC reporter approached with her cameraman. "Colonel, could we get a statement about what's happening here?" "What's happening," Colonel Ashworth said carefully, "is one soldier showing respect to another. Private Wellington is performing his duty admirably under difficult circumstances. The American gentleman is conducting himself with perfect military courtesy. But what about protocol? The guards aren't supposed to break character." Colonel Ashworth looked at the reporter, then at the crowd, then at the two soldiers locked in their standoff. Her next words would either escalate the situation or provide a path forward. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "the spirit of military tradition is more important than the letter of regulations. The question isn't whether rules allow acknowledgement. It's whether honor demands it." Colonel Ashworth's words hung in the air like a challenge to centuries of rigid protocol. The BBC reporter sensed the significance and signaled her cameraman to keep rolling. Around the courtyard, conversations stopped as people strained to hear what would happen next. Even the other guards at their posts seemed to be listening more intently, though they maintained their professional stillness. James felt something shift inside him when he heard his commanding officer's words. The spirit of military tradition is more important than the letter of regulations. It was permission, not explicit but unmistakable to anyone who understood military communication. Colonel Ashworth was telling him to make the choice between rigid protocol and warrior respect. Marcus sensed the change too, though he couldn't hear the quiet conversations happening behind him. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. The tension was still there, but it felt different now, expectant rather than confrontational. His shoulder burned from holding the salute for 40 minutes, but he'd made his decision. He would stand there until either his respect was acknowledged or he was forcibly removed. The crowd had grown to nearly 200 people, with more arriving every few minutes as social media posts continued to spread. The hashtag #Diedersch Marine Royal Guard was beginning to trend on Twitter, with photos and videos of the standoff being shared around the world. Most commenters supported Marcus's gesture, viewing it as a beautiful display of military brotherhood. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a military historian who happened to be visiting London, had been watching for the past 20 minutes. She approached Colonel Ashworth with the confidence of someone accustomed to speaking with military officers. "Colonel, if I may," she said quietly, "I've studied military traditions for 30 years. What that Marine is doing, one warrior acknowledging another across national boundaries, that's older than the monarchy itself. The protocols that prevent acknowledgement are relatively modern innovations." Colonel Ashworth looked at the historian with interest. "Go on." "Medieval knights acknowledged each other regardless of which lord they served. Roman legions showed respect to worthy enemies. The idea that ceremonial duty prevents basic military courtesy is actually contrary to most historical military tradition. The colonel nodded slowly. She'd been thinking along similar lines but hadn't wanted to challenge protocol without solid reasoning. The historian's perspective provided valuable context for what might otherwise be seen as a dangerous precedent. Marcus heard footsteps approaching and saw a shadow fall across his peripheral vision, but he didn't move his eyes from James's face. He'd noticed subtle changes in the young guard's expression over the past few minutes. A slight relaxation around the eyes, a barely perceptible shift in posture. Something was building toward a resolution. "Sergeant Thompson," Colonel Ashworth said, positioning herself where Marcus could hear clearly without breaking his position. "I understand you're a combat veteran." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied without moving. "3 deployments, Afghanistan. And you're offering this salute as one soldier to another?" "Yes, ma'am." "With full respect for Private Wellington's service and the traditions he represents." Colonel Ashworth was quiet for a moment, processing the situation from every angle. The crowd was listening intently, the media was recording, and her decision would be scrutinized and analyzed. But more importantly, 2 soldiers were caught in an impossible situation, and it was her responsibility to find a resolution that honored both duty and brotherhood. James could hear the conversation and felt his heart rate increasing. His commanding officer was speaking directly to the American, acknowledging him by name and rank. This wasn't going to end with Marcus being quietly escorted away. Something significant was about to happen. "Private Wellington," Colonel Ashworth said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent courtyard. "You've maintained your post admirably for over an hour under extraordinary circumstances. Your discipline and professionalism reflect well on the regiment." James felt a surge of pride at the praise, but also growing certainty about what was coming next. "However," the colonel continued, "military tradition encompasses more than ceremonial protocol. It includes the bonds between warriors and the recognition of mutual respect and sacrifice." The crowd held its collective breath. Even the children seemed to sense that something important was happening. "Private Wellington, you are authorized to acknowledge Sergeant Thompson's salute in the manner befitting one soldier, recognizing another." The words hit the courtyard like a thunderclap. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as people realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. James felt a mix of relief and anticipation flood through him. The impossible choice had been taken away, replaced by clear authorization to follow his warrior's instincts. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. After 45 minutes of holding his salute, he was finally going to receive the acknowledgement he sought. But more than that, he was witnessing something beautiful, the triumph of human connection over bureaucratic rigidity. James began to move with deliberate precision. Every eye in the courtyard was on him as he slowly, carefully, brought his right hand up in a perfect military salute. The movement was fluid and professional, carried out with the same precision he brought to all his ceremonial duties. But this was different. This was personal. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers as the 2 soldiers held their mutual salute. Cameras flashed and phones recorded as centuries of rigid protocol gave way to simple human respect. Marcus felt tears pricking his eyes as he finally received the acknowledgement he'd sought, not just for himself, but for all the warriors who served without recognition. For 30 seconds, the 2 men held their salute, looking directly at each other across the barriers of nationality, service branch, and ceremonial protocol. In that moment, they weren't an American Marine and a British Guard. They were simply 2 warriors acknowledging each other's service and sacrifice. When they finally lowered their salute simultaneously, the crowd's applause intensified. People were crying, cheering, and embracing strangers as if they'd all witnessed something sacred. And perhaps they had. A moment when human connection transcended institutional barriers. Marcus stepped back from the barrier and came to attention one final time, this time offering a slight bow of gratitude to both James and Colonel Ashworth. The gesture was Japanese in origin, something he'd learned during joint training exercises, but its meaning was universal. Profound respect and appreciation. Colonel Ashworth approached the barrier herself. "Sergeant Thompson, on behalf of the regiment and the British Army, thank you for your service and your gesture of respect. You've reminded us all what military brotherhood truly means." Marcus finally allowed himself to relax his military bearing slightly. "Thank you, ma'am." And thank you for having the courage to choose honor over bureaucracy." The colonel smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her during the entire incident. Sometimes the right choice is also the most difficult one. As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached Marcus to shake his hand or simply say thank you. They might not have fully understood the military significance of what had happened, but they recognized they'd witnessed something important about respect, tradition, and human connection. The BBC reporter conducted several more interviews, capturing the emotional responses of witnesses. The story would run on the evening news and be picked up by media outlets around the world. But for Marcus and James, the media attention was secondary to the simple fact that military brotherhood had prevailed over bureaucratic inflexibility. The Marine challenged the Royal Guard. Part 5. The immediate aftermath of the salute exchange was electric. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, small groups formed around Marcus, each person wanting to understand what they had just witnessed. The little girl who had asked why the guard wouldn't say hello tugged on her father's hand and pointed at Marcus. "Daddy!" The soldier finally said hello back, she announced with the satisfaction of seeing the world make sense again. Marcus knelt down to her level, his formal military bearing softening into the gentleness he reserved for children. "Yes, sweetheart," he did. "Sometimes it just takes a little while for people to understand each other." The girl's father extended his hand to Marcus. "I'm David Chen, and this is my daughter Emma. I'm not military myself, but what you did, it felt important. Thank you for helping us see something special today." Marcus shook the man's hand, struck by how the simple act of mutual respect had touched people who had no military background. "Sometimes we all need reminders about what really matters," he replied. Dr. Hartwell, the military historian, approached with a thoughtful expression. "Sergeant Thompson, I hope you don't mind my asking, but what inspired you to take this stand today? You must have known it could create complications." Marcus considered the question carefully. Around him, people were still talking in excited tones about what they'd witnessed, but he found himself drawn back to the deeper reasons behind his actions. "Ma'am, I lost 3 brothers in Afghanistan," he said quietly. "Good Marines who died protecting people they'd never met, fighting for ideals they believed in completely. When they came home, there were no ceremonies, no crowds, no recognition. They got flag-draped coffins and families who will never be the same." The historian nodded, understanding beginning to show in her eyes. "I'm not saying ceremonial duty isn't important," Marcus continued. "But sometimes the ceremony becomes more important than what it's supposed to represent. Today felt like a chance to remind everyone, including myself, that behind all the protocol and tradition, we're just soldiers trying to do our duty." Dr. Hartwell smiled warmly. "You've just articulated something I've been trying to explain in academic papers for years. The form should serve the substance, not the other way around." Meanwhile, James continued his ceremonial duty, but the atmosphere around his post had fundamentally changed. Tourists still took pictures and posed for selfies, but there was a new sense of respect in their approach. People seemed to understand that they weren't just looking at a colorful tradition, but at a real soldier performing real duty. A group of British veterans had gathered near James's post, drawn by news of the incident. They stood quietly, their own military bearing evident despite their civilian clothes. One of them, a Falklands War veteran named Robert Sterling, spoke quietly to his companions. "That's what we've been missing," he said. "The connection between what we do and why we do it." The American reminded everyone that we're not just tourist attractions. His friend, a woman who'd served in the Royal Navy, nodded in agreement. "My granddaughter asked me once why the guards never smile or wave. I told her it was because they're working, protecting important things. But I think today she understood it better than I explained it." Colonel Ashworth had remained in the courtyard, observing the crowd's reactions and the ongoing media coverage. She was already receiving calls from superiors asking for detailed reports, but she felt confident in her decision. The situation had been resolved without incident, and the response from both the public and the international media had been overwhelmingly positive. A junior officer approached with a tablet showing social media coverage of the incident. The story was spreading rapidly with hashtags like Dacha Military Brotherhood and Respect Across Borders trending globally. Comments poured in from military personnel around the world, sharing their own stories of international cooperation and mutual respect. "Colonel," the officer said, "we're getting messages from military commands in 12 different countries. All positive, all praising the gesture and the response. Colonel Ashworth wasn't surprised. Military personnel understood the significance of what had happened in ways that civilians might not fully grasp. The mutual salute wasn't just about two individuals. It represented the professional respect that connected warriors across all boundaries of nationality and service. Marcus found himself in an impromptu receiving line as tourists, veterans, and local Londoners approached to thank him or share their own stories. An elderly British man introduced himself as a World War II veteran and clasped Marcus's hand firmly. "I served alongside Americans in Italy," he said with emotion thick in his voice. "Your gesture today brought back memories of good men who understood that the uniform mattered less than the heart wearing it." A young woman who'd been recording the entire incident approached with tears in her eyes. "My brother is deployed with the army in Estonia," she said. "Seeing this today, it reminds me that what he's doing matters, that people notice and appreciate it." Each interaction reinforced Marcus's belief that his decision had been right. The ceremony and tradition were important, but they were meant to serve a larger purpose, connecting people to the sacrifices made on their behalf and fostering understanding between nations. As the afternoon wore on, an unexpected visitor arrived at the palace. Ambassador Richardson, the American ambassador to the United Kingdom, had been informed of the incident by his staff and had driven over personally to assess the situation. He was a career diplomat who understood the delicate balance of international relations. Colonel Ashworth met with the ambassador privately, explaining the situation and the decisions that had been made. She was prepared for criticism or concerns about precedent, but the ambassador's response surprised her. "Colonel, in 30 years of diplomatic service, I've seen grand gestures and formal ceremonies that accomplished far less than what happened here today. One Marine's simple act of respect has done more for Anglo-American relations than most state dinners." The ambassador asked to meet Marcus personally, and their conversation was brief but meaningful. "Sergeant Thompson, you've represented your country admirably today. Sometimes the most important diplomacy happens between individuals rather than governments." Marcus was humbled by the attention, but remained focused on the simple truth that had motivated his actions. "Sir, I just wanted to show respect to a fellow soldier. Everything else that happened was because other people understood that respect matters." As evening approached and the crowds began to thin, Marcus prepared to leave. But first he returned to James's post one final time. The guard had been relieved and replaced by another soldier, but Marcus wanted to complete the circle of respect he'd started. He approached the barrier and came to attention, but this time he simply nodded respectfully to the new guard and spoke quietly. "Thank you for your service and for maintaining the traditions that honor us all." The new guard, who had heard about the earlier incident, gave an almost imperceptible nod in return, not breaking protocol, but acknowledging the respect offered. As Marcus walked away from Buckingham Palace, he reflected on the unexpected turn his simple leave day had taken. He'd come to London seeking understanding, perhaps even seeking purpose after the challenges of returning from deployment. What he'd found was proof that military brotherhood transcended all artificial boundaries, and that respect, genuinely offered and graciously received, could bridge any gap. The story would be told and retold in military circles for years to come. But for Marcus, the most important outcome was personal. He'd honored his fallen brothers and reminded himself why their sacrifice mattered. In doing so, he'd helped others understand it too. 3 weeks after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus found himself dealing with consequences he never could have anticipated. What had started as a simple gesture of respect had sparked a global conversation about military tradition, protocol, and the bonds between warriors across national boundaries. He was back at Camp Pendleton, having cut his leave short when the story exploded across international media. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, had summoned him to explain the situation that had made him famous overnight. Marcus sat in her office, still processing how quickly everything had changed. "Sergeant Thompson," Colonel Martinez began, reviewing a thick folder of news clippings and reports. "In 12 years of command, I've never had to brief the commandant about a Marine's tourist activities. Want to explain how a vacation in London became an international incident?" Marcus straightened in his chair. "Ma'am, I was simply showing respect to a fellow service member." I didn't anticipate the media attention or the response it would generate. Colonel Martinez studied him carefully. She'd known Marcus for 2 years and respected his service record, but this situation was unprecedented. The British ambassador has sent formal thanks to the State Department. The Commandant has received calls from military leaders in 8 countries. The President's staff has inquired about your background. And somehow, you claim you were just being polite? Yes, ma'am. I saw a soldier doing his duty and wanted to acknowledge that service. Everything else that happened was beyond my control or intention. The colonel leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Sergeant, you've created more positive international coverage for the Corps in 3 weeks than our public affairs office manages in a year. The question is, what do we do with you now? Meanwhile, in London, Private James Wellington was experiencing his own unexpected fame. The Royal Guard who had returned the salute was being interviewed by military historians, receiving letters from veterans around the world, and finding himself at the center of discussions about modernizing ceremonial protocols. Colonel Ashworth had been both praised and criticized for her decision to authorize the salute exchange. Traditional military voices argued she had violated centuries of protocol, while progressive voices hailed her for choosing human connection over rigid bureaucracy. She found herself testifying before a parliamentary committee about the incident. Committee members, she explained to the assembled politicians, the decision I made was based on military judgment and an understanding of what military tradition truly represents. Protocol serves honor, not the other way around. The committee chair, a former Royal Navy officer himself, leaned forward with interest. Colonel, some have suggested that your decision sets a dangerous precedent. How do you respond to concerns that ceremonial discipline will be compromised? Sir, Private Wellington maintained perfect discipline throughout a 45-minute period under extraordinary pressure. The American Marine demonstrated textbook military bearing while challenging protocol. Both soldiers showed that true discipline comes from understanding the purpose behind the rules, not blind adherence to them. Back at Camp Pendleton, Marcus was discovering that his actions had inspired similar gestures around the world. A video had surfaced of Australian and American soldiers saluting each other at a joint training exercise, explicitly citing Marcus's example. Canadian and British troops had been photographed in mutual salutes during a NATO exercise. Military social media was filled with images of international military courtesy. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a professor of military sociology at the Naval War College, had reached out to interview Marcus for a research paper on modern military culture. During their conversation, she helped him understand the broader significance of what had occurred. Sergeant Thompson, what you did tapped into something that's been missing from military discourse for years. The human element that connects all service members regardless of nationality. In an era of increasing international cooperation, your gesture reminded everyone that military partnership starts with individual respect. Marcus found her perspective enlightening. Ma'am, I didn't think about it in those terms. I just saw another soldier and wanted to acknowledge him. That's exactly why it was so powerful, Dr. Walsh replied. It was authentic, spontaneous, and based on genuine military values rather than political considerations. The ripple effects continued to spread. Military academies around the world were incorporating discussions of the incident into their ethics and leadership courses. The video of the salute exchange had been viewed over 50 million times, with comments pouring in from military families, veterans, and civilians who had been moved by the display of international military brotherhood. James Wellington had been invited to speak at a military history conference about his experience during the incident. Standing before an audience of historians, military officers, and academics, he reflected on the moment that had changed his understanding of ceremonial duty. When Sergeant Thompson offered his salute, I faced a choice between following procedure and following principle, he explained to the audience. Colonel Ashworth's authorization allowed me to choose principle, but even without that authorization, I believe acknowledging a fellow warrior's respect would have been the right choice. The conference audience, comprised largely of military professionals, understood the courage required to make such a statement. Protocol violations in ceremonial units were career-ending offenses, but James was arguing that some violations served higher military values. Marcus received a letter that particularly moved him, from the widow of one of his fallen Marines. Rodriguez's wife had written to thank him for finding a way to honor her husband's memory that reached beyond military circles into the broader public consciousness. "Marcus," she wrote, "when Carlos died, I worried that people would forget what he died for. Seeing the way people responded to your gesture in London, seeing how it reminded them that real soldiers with real families make real sacrifices, that gives his death meaning in a way I never expected." The letter reinforced Marcus's belief that his actions had been worthwhile, regardless of any complications they had created for his career or personal life. Colonel Martinez called Marcus back to her office a month after their first meeting. This time she had a different kind of paperwork on her desk, orders and recommendations rather than incident reports. "Sergeant Thompson, I've received an interesting request from the State Department. They're looking for Marines to serve as military liaisons at various embassies. The position requires someone who understands military culture, can work with international partners, and has demonstrated ability to represent American values positively." Marcus looked at the orders with surprise. He'd expected discipline or at least official censure for creating an international incident. Instead, he was being offered a career opportunity. "Ma'am, they want me for diplomatic duty because I saluted a British guard?" Colonel Martinez smiled. "They want you because you showed that American military personnel understand honor, respect international partnerships, and can think beyond narrow protocol when bigger principles are at stake. Those are exactly the qualities they need in diplomatic postings." The offer represented a significant change in Marcus's career trajectory, but it also felt like validation that his instincts in London had been correct. Military service was about more than following orders. It was about upholding values and building bridges between peoples and nations. As he considered the opportunity, Marcus realized that his simple gesture of respect had created something far more significant than he'd ever imagined. It had sparked a global conversation about what military service meant in an interconnected world, and had demonstrated that individual actions could still make a difference in international relations. 1 year later, Marcus stood in the garden of the American ambassador's residence in London, wearing his dress blue uniform and preparing for a ceremony he never could have imagined. The anniversary of his salute at Buckingham Palace had become an opportunity for something far more significant: the establishment of an international military fellowship program designed to strengthen bonds between allied forces. The past year had transformed his life in ways both profound and unexpected. After accepting the diplomatic posting, Marcus had spent months learning the intricate balance between military protocol and international relations. His assignment to the London embassy had been specifically requested by Ambassador Richardson, who believed Marcus's instinctive understanding of military brotherhood made him uniquely qualified for the position. "Sergeant Thompson," the ambassador said as they reviewed the day's schedule, "when I recommended you for this position, I knew you had good instincts. What I didn't anticipate was how those instincts would continue to open doors we didn't even know existed. The ceremony they were preparing for would bring together military personnel from 12 NATO countries for the inauguration of the International Military Respect Initiative, a program that encouraged cross-cultural military exchanges and emphasized the shared values that connected warriors across national boundaries. The idea had grown directly from the global response to Marcus's original gesture. Colonel Ashworth arrived early, wearing her full dress uniform and carrying herself with the same dignity Marcus remembered from their first meeting. She had been promoted following a comprehensive review of her handling of the original incident, with military leadership concluding that her decision had enhanced rather than compromised British military prestige. "Sergeant Thompson," she said as they met in the embassy's main hall, "I'm curious to see what you've accomplished in your year of diplomatic service. The reports I've received suggest you've been quite busy." Marcus had indeed been busy. His role as military liaison had evolved beyond traditional diplomatic functions into something more innovative. He'd helped establish exchange programs between American and British military academies, facilitated joint training exercises that emphasized cultural understanding alongside tactical cooperation, and served as a bridge between formal diplomatic channels and practical military cooperation. But perhaps most importantly, he'd become a symbol of the idea that individual soldiers could influence international relations through simple acts of authentic respect and understanding. James Wellington arrived with a delegation from the British Army, having been selected to represent the Royal Guards at the ceremony. His own career had flourished following the salute incident, with his thoughtful reflection on the balance between protocol and principle, earning him recognition as a rising leader within his regiment. "Marcus," James said as they shook hands, using first names despite the formal setting. "It's remarkable how much has grown from that one afternoon, isn't it?" The friendship that had developed between the two men over the past year had surprised both of them. What had started as a moment of mutual military respect had evolved into genuine personal connection, facilitated by James's assignment to the British Embassy's Military Affairs Office. "I keep thinking about what that historian said," Marcus replied, "about how the form should serve the substance. Everything that's happened since then has been about finding ways to honor that principle." The ceremony itself was attended by military officers from around the world, diplomats, veterans organizations, and members of the public who had followed the story since its beginning. Dr. Hartwell, the military historian who had provided crucial context during the original incident, delivered the keynote address. "What we're celebrating today," she told the assembled audience, "isn't just one American Marine's gesture of respect or one British officer's courage in authorizing an appropriate response. We're celebrating the triumph of authentic military values over bureaucratic inertia." As the formal proceedings continued, Marcus found his thoughts drifting to the Marines he'd lost in Afghanistan. Rodriguez, Chen, and Williams had died in service to ideals that transcended national boundaries: freedom, protection of the innocent, resistance to tyranny. The international cooperation he now witnessed daily seemed like a fitting memorial to their sacrifice. The ceremony concluded with a recreation of the original salute, but this time it was performed by representatives from all 12 participating nations. As 12 military officers raised their hands in simultaneous salute, the symbolism was unmistakable: respect and cooperation replacing competition and misunderstanding. Following the ceremony, Marcus was approached by a young Marine lieutenant who had recently arrived in London for a training exchange. The lieutenant, Amanda Foster, had cited Marcus's example in her application for the program. "Sergeant Thompson, I wanted to thank you for showing that military diplomacy doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes the most powerful gestures are the simplest ones." Her comment reminded Marcus of the little girl Emma, who had asked why the guard wouldn't say hello back. Children understood instinctively what adults often complicated: that respect and kindness were always appropriate responses to respect and kindness offered. As the evening wound down, Marcus and James found themselves standing in the same spot where the original incident had occurred. The palace looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. Where once there had been rigid protocol preventing acknowledgement between soldiers, there was now an established framework for international military courtesy and cooperation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't saluted back?" James asked as they watched tourists taking pictures with the current guards. Marcus considered the question. "I think something would have happened eventually. The need for authentic connection between military professionals is too strong to be suppressed by protocol forever. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time." James nodded thoughtfully. Colonel Ashworth said something similar once: that the incident was less about us as individuals and more about broader forces that were already in motion. A year of diplomatic service had taught Marcus that individual actions, no matter how spontaneous or simple, could catalyze changes that were already waiting to happen. His salute hadn't created the desire for better international military cooperation. It had simply provided a focal point for expressing that desire. As they prepared to leave, Marcus noticed a small plaque that had been installed near the guard post where their original exchange had taken place. It read, "In recognition of the bonds of respect and brotherhood that unite warriors in service to freedom, regardless of the flag they serve." The plaque was modest and unobtrusive, but its presence confirmed that the moment had achieved a kind of permanence in military tradition. Future generations of soldiers would learn about the day when protocol gave way to principle and when, too, warriors chose honor over bureaucracy. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from his sister back in California. She'd been following his year in London and was proud of what he'd accomplished. But her message was characteristically direct. "When are you coming home? Mom wants to know if she should plan for Christmas dinner." The question reminded him that despite all the ceremony and international significance, he was still just a Marine from San Diego who'd tried to do the right thing in a complicated situation. The diplomatic posting would end eventually, and he'd return to more traditional military duties. But the lessons he'd learned about the power of authentic respect and the importance of choosing principle over procedure would stay with him throughout his career, as he walked away from Buckingham Palace for what might be the last time in his diplomatic capacity. Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He'd honored his fallen brothers, strengthened international cooperation, and helped prove that individual soldiers could still make a difference in a complex world. Most importantly, he'd learned that military tradition was strongest when it served its underlying purpose, connecting warriors across all boundaries in shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. The salute he'd offered that afternoon had been simple, but its impact had been profound because it had been authentic. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, the most important victories weren't won on battlefields but in moments when individuals chose to honor the best aspects of military tradition, rather than just its most rigid requirements. His year as a diplomatic liaison was ending, but the example he'd set would continue inspiring others to choose brotherhood over bureaucracy for years to come.